whole time. And as Norval mentioned, I've been really interested in innovation and the innovation process for a while now. And kind of what got me started, I've been a long time electronics and reliability focused engineer, and so lots of products early in their pipeline, some of which I thought were great ideas that never made it, some of which I thought were crazy and ended up becoming big successes. And so that really got me interested in why some products, ideas, and tools make it and why some don't. And like any good quality professional, I figured there had to be some good tools or processes out there that might make me and my coworkers more successful in both validating ideas and in selling them. And so, I researched it for a while and also ended up going back to school. The University of Texas at Austin offers a master's program in technology commercialization, which is a really neat marriage of a technical background and the business side. And so out of that, I learned a number of techniques that I thought were really helpful in doing that. So I'm going to share kind of a case study today and some of the basic processes that you can use both inside your company as well as your own ideas, your friends' ideas, and seeing if you can make a business or you sell those in the marketplace. And so as Norval said, you'll get the slides and recording, but we don't have a lot of time today, so my contact information is up there. Please do feel free to email or call if you have any other questions or want to discuss it further, because I really find the topic really interesting. And so one of the first things that I learned very quickly is not to fall in love with an idea. We come up with ideas, or our friends, coworkers have them, and one of the things that you'll quickly learn is that ideas really are a dime a dozen. 10 people can have the same idea, someone can make a success of it, and someone else can make an absolute catastrophe out of it. And so you got to get over that the idea is the value. It really isn't. And one of the kind of striking examples that you might have come across recently, for anyone who saw the movie The Founder about Ray Kroc and McDonald's franchise, I thought that was really kind of a perfect example. The McDonald's brothers, had this idea. They came up with the restaurant concept and all the streamlining and, fascinating process and techniques for making, a fast food restaurant work. And they had wanted to expand their idea, their inventions, their development, but it was really Ray Kroc and his sales and his take on it that made it into the international chain it is today. And so you can take away who you like or not from that movie, but it really does show the differences that just simply the idea has between two different people, how they would choose to execute it as to how big it would grow or what it could turn into. So the idea is a starting point, but only that. It's really all about the execution and all about making things happen. And a really good book to read is one by Rob Adams, who's actually a teacher and entrepreneur here in Austin, good hard kick in the ass. He's got several that kind of describe some of the processes that we're going to talk about today, at least some aspects of it. So first, when we talk about the idea versus something you actually commercialize and can make money out of, it's not just the idea. The idea is really just your starting point. It's very similar to like the plan, do, check, act process that many of us are familiar with. Here you take that idea, you research it, you do some prototypes, you do some evaluation, you do some more research, you refine, change, modify that idea, and you keep going through it. And then there are also ways that you can determine whether your idea really has legs or not, whether it's a, quote, a good idea or a bad idea. And you can do this through a number of techniques, which we'll talk about, what we call those real-world interviews, data, market analysis, talking to potential users and customers to really help you validate your idea and also help you streamline or focus your idea so that you're building something that someone in the market would actually pay for. Quite the opposite of if, that kind of if you build it, they will come kind of deal. And so, why would you need a process and a commercialization process? Well, the cold, hard reality is that over 60% of all new products placed out in the market fail. And this is from companies, very large ones with deep resources. So think like, the Coca-Cola, the new Coke fiasco, and many other ones like that out in the world. These are companies that have plenty of resources to do market research and validation, and they still have a significant number of products fail. For startups or small businesses, that failure rate is over 90%. And so without a process to help at least start you in the right direction, you very much risk wasting your money, but more importantly, your time. Because your time you can't get back. So time invested in a bad idea or a poor idea is really much lost forever. And so, one of the ways and one technique that's out there that I really like a lot is something called the QuickLIFT process. And it's from a fellow out of Texas A&M called, his name Brett Cornwell. He's down there at the bottom. He's published kind of a brief paper on it, kind of describing the methodology, but I'm going to share that with you today. And it's a quick way of validating, if an idea is worth your time and effort to pursue further. So should you even, take it and you put too much time and effort, spend a few hours with this QuickLIFT process and you get a pretty good answer. But I first wanted to start out with, innovation, because there's lots of definitions for innovation out there in the market, and on the web, and a lot of people will confuse simply something new and novel with innovative. And something that's innovative is really more than that. So yes, it's different, but it's different really in a way that adds value. It is something useful that solves a problem that someone has or an unmet need. It's not just different. Different by itself doesn't qualify simply as an innovation. And we discussed that a little more in the webinar last fall. And the goal of the QuickLIFT process is to reduce that risk for failure by knowing who you're selling to and what they really care about, what they would be willing to pay for, and what they'll use for free, but what they give you money for, and avoid being one of those, if you build it, they will come. I've got this great solution, and then you go out looking for what problem or who can it solve it for. And so that's what we're looking at, that blend of the innovation, what's possible, and what's sellable or commercializable in this case. And when we're talking about this QuickLIFT kind of assessment, it's really just, it's a snapshot in time, so it's something that's potentially you have to repeat again in that cyclical fashion, but it's a quick go or no go. So, the intent is to save you time and effort. Should you spend more of you or your company's time, money, or effort into pursuing this particular idea? And so at its basis, we're really talking about a step-by-step approach for evaluating a new product, a new process, or an idea. And so the goal here is to start out with, who am I really selling to? Is it businesses? Is it a consumer? Is it U.S.? Is it worldwide? Is it children? Is it adults? Really identifying who's going to be the end user of this product and narrowing that down as much as you can when you're getting started. So you're not attempting to kind of conquer the world. And then once you've identified some potential markets for each of those markets, identify users, licensees, those types of things to go out and then talk to them. You would contact experts in that industry, the companies in the marketplace, and identify what opportunities are out there, what risks are out there, what problems really do need to be solved, and what they kind of care about. And here, this can be done in subjects you are familiar with, but it can also be done in technologies you know nothing about. That's the beauty of the process, is once you learn it, you can really apply it to any kind of technology. And again, back to the idea that ideas are commodities. If you indeed wanted to start your own business and didn't think you were the idea person, what you'll find is that ideas are for sale. All the universities in the United States and even outside the United States have technology arms where they license patents, they license processes they've developed in the lab, they have no desire or ability to commercialize, they'll give you those ideas. They're looking for people who can figure out how to really commercialize them or sell them. So you don't have to be an idea person. Again, you can find them through friends, acquaintances, you can buy them off of databases and then go out and vet them and you see what your opportunities are with that. And then, once you kind of start through those basic steps of the process, obviously you need some documentation. And so, how do you kind of organize the data that you gather? Well, first, like with any good report is, what is it? What is the idea? What is the technology? What is the product that you're potentially thinking that you would sell or try to commercialize? And the goal here is something in 2 or 3 sentences. If it takes you a page or 6 paragraphs to explain it, it's either probably still too complex or you don't understand it very well. It needs to be short, sweet, to the point. We'll be thinking like elevator pitch, which I'll tell you a little bit more about during the time that we have here today. And then we want to talk about the technology benefits. And this is a really hard concept to grasp for a lot of people, what the distinction is here. So we're talking about benefits to the user, not the functions or the features, not the whiz-bang, neat, cool things that it does, or even how it does it, but how does it benefit the user? Does it speed up their work? Does it make it more accurate? Is it cheaper? Does it cover more areas or do more things than other tools that they have today? What are those end user benefits? Why would they care? Not, it does X, Y, Z and it's got all these features, because what you'll find is that people will get lost in that and it's not really of interest. It's really, you think about what is their pain, what do they need, and how would you solve it? How would this do it for them? And so that's the goal of the benefit side. And then when you're looking at those potential markets to sell to, you need to kind of get a base understanding of just how big their pain is, the problem that you're trying to solve. Is it a huge problem? Does it impact the bottom line in and out every day? Does it require more staff to handle, more paperwork to do? And that helps you define just how big your opportunities are and whether they're niche or global or worldwide or best in a particular segment, which again helps you narrow down and kind of create a focused unit business part of the world within your own company, for example. And then in terms of the market, how much interest is there? Is it a little bit of interest? Yeah, that's kind of cool, but my problem's not so big, and the pain, I've got some alternatives or homegrown solutions that I do today that aren't bad, but if something were good enough, I might consider it. And then who might partners be? Because sometimes it really isn't worth going alone. If you could partner up with someone and create what we call kind of a platform solution rather than just a standalone. Your tool, if it's software, might integrate to an existing software that's out there rather than being a standalone tool. So you look for other people out there in adjacent spaces that might also have marketing, staff, and resources that you could add to your own in order to make it more likely to be successful. And of course, you have to also know where you are in the development timeline of your idea. Is it really just a concept, which is really ideal for the process? You want to start on this process very early, so very early prototype stage or idea stage. And it really becomes tough for most of us once you have a product to go do a very good market research assessment, because you get vested into your product and your features and ideas, and you begin to try to sell things rather than trying to understand what the market wants or needs. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid building out some complex product that might have features no one will pay for, or complexities no one needs, or worse yet, you build a great tool but it solves a problem that no one has, or that's not important enough for them to pay for, or that they don't think is really a useful idea in their particular space. So we want to help you save both time and money by going through the process. Other things that are important in your commercialization, your early research is, do you have IP, intellectual property, whether it's trademarks, patents, secrets? you don't have to have these things, but you just have to understand what the landscape is out there in order to make sure that you're not going in places where there's already lots of protection covered and you could be infringing on someone else's technology, or you're using a name that would be confusing to someone else's. So doing, again, these things early will help you, pick out good names for business, good names for a product, and also protect you as well. And that kind of leads into understanding the competition and competing technologies. And this is another area that really trips people up a lot because, I work with a lot of startups and newer businesses, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard, oh, well, I have no competition. No one else does things this way. No one else has this kind of thing. I'm the only game in town. And that's just flat out not true. Or if it is, if you really have no competition, you probably have no business either. Because when we're thinking about competition, it's not just people who are solving things the same way you are with your idea. Clearly, if you are coming up with a better idea, they have a method of doing it today, even if it's only manual, even if it's paper, even if it's very cumbersome or complex. They have an alternative which they're using, and that's what you have to consider as part of your competition too, a do-it-yourself kind of solution or a homegrown solution, in addition to competition that's like you or similar to you. And one of the things that people struggle with too is that having a few competitors out there is a good thing because that means there is real opportunity to pursue. You just have to be better at it, execute it better, have better product offerings in your competition in order to be able to succeed. But a little competition is actually a good thing. And the other thing that's part of the process of evaluation is looking at those barriers to market entry. And that's where it really helps to look at those competing technologies and competitors, as well as information that you can find out there, industry reports, Statista, other research databases that can kind of tell you about the market. Who are the big players or the small players? What challenges do they face? Are there duties, tariffs, barriers? Are there regulatory hurdles? Which there definitely are in some industries like medical and med tech and defense, threats, currencies, world markets, again, depending on where you might want to launch your business or idea, what kind of keep people in or out, and these can work to your advantage or disadvantage depending on your size and scale. They can be everything from needing to build a factory to needing representatives or salespeople, and how you're going to overcome those. And when you do these high-level assessments in each of these areas, it becomes more obvious as to how much work you would have to put into an idea and let you make a good go, no-go assessment. Because you'll come out of this kind of research phase with a much better understanding of what the landscape looks like, what the costs and barriers are, as well as what the opportunities are, so you can make a calculated decision on whether the time and money you need is going to pay back in the actual market return and interest. That gets you to that go, no-go recommendation. And before I get into the case study, just a few things about performing market research, because this is another area that people really still struggle with when they're trying to sell their ideas within a company or launch a new business outside. It's the concept of market research. Most of us have heard the term. There's lots of companies and resources out there. Obviously, if we start in the middle, in the green area here on the screen, under the secondary research, that's databases, companies that specialize in market research reports, databases like Statista. Your library has access to them, universities, where you can go in and look at market segmentation at certain types of high-level or even in-depth reports that are already out there. So those are one source, but what we're really talking about in a quick look and in validating your own ideas or business ideas is primary research. And that's in research that you or someone close to you and your idea personally has to do. And a lot of technology people find this really painful because it requires more like the salesmanship approach. You're cold calling people, you're contacting people who don't know you and aren't familiar with you, won't necessarily be nice to you and give you the answers that you'd like to hear, but that's exactly what you need. Because many people will take an idea and they'll shop it around to their coworkers, their family and friends. And these are people who have a vested interest in not hurting your feelings and wanting to support you, so it can be really hard to get the full truth from them, the cold, hard facts. Or it can be in an area that you're not as familiar with or don't have the contacts, and so how do you go out and find them? And so that's where you really have to go out and look for who those industry people are, the publications, the conferences, and get some people to talk to you on the phone, face-to-face, and meeting, and go through, what they believe are the challenges and opportunities. Without you trying to sell them something, you're really kind of doing an assessment of your idea. What problems do these people have? How bad are those problems? What would they be willing to pay for? And the really neat thing about this process is it can either help you dump your idea or refine it. So in the worst case, obviously, the idea will have no legs at all. You'll get uniformly poor response from the people you choose to talk to in the various industries. But in the best case, you might find that your problem or the solution you're proposing is part of a solution or obliquely related to the problem you were solving. But these people will give you ideas on how to make that idea better, how to refine your concept, and certainly have not to waste time or effort into features they don't need, they don't want, and won't pay for. And so, many times when I've done these, they've given me ideas that I hadn't considered before. They've uncovered problems that I didn't realize, or how the extent of what some of those problems were once I started talking to these people. And for the quick look portion, you need 7 to 10 really productive interviews to get a good idea of if that idea or concept or prototype is worth it. And once you get into out-and-out commercialization, you have to scale that up to over 100, again, to expand that way. But this is kind of like the light and dirty look. So how do you find some of these people? Well, things like this, things like your ASQ sections, your LinkedIn contacts and connections, your alumni groups, publications, and it may sound surprising, but most people are quite willing and happy to talk about their work and to share ideas with you. Certainly when you're just evaluating, as long as you're not trying to sell them things, people are quite willing to talk about what their problems and issues are and how you might be able to help them sell them better. So that's some of the keys on market research. And this is a challenge a lot of people have, is the whole cold calling thing, or calling people you don't know. How do you get people to talk to you? And it's easier than you think, especially if you haven't done it and you find it hard, but I kind of call this my concept of the elevator pitch. And, first it's just very brief, who you are, how you found them. I found you through this publication, I found it really helpful. Could I ask you some more questions about what you wrote about? Or we went to the same school or in the same group or whatever, what do you have in common with them? And then, a brief description, again, 1 or 2 sentences maximum, not the 6-page dissertation, but a brief description. I'm interested in medical technology devices that are used in the physician's office, and what some of the general problems are in the industry and the landscape, and I see you're an expert on that. I thought you could share some of your ideas with me, and how they could help you. And then this kind of helps frame it. You keep it short and brief. You don't want to sell. This is not a selling opportunity at all. You're not trying to sell your concept or idea. You're trying to determine if what you think you are solving is really a need that the industry has. And so, I've got some little examples in there too in the slide deck that I'll share with you. And so the goal here is to really listen. You have a couple key questions, but you keep these kind of interviews or discussions that you have free form so that you're really hearing what their problems are. And you kind of look at it from a whole holistic standpoint. Is, what are your problems? What's that pain? What's important to you? What do you think of what's out there? And then, how does someone, if I had this widget, gadget idea that could solve a problem for you, how would you find out about it? how would you buy it? How would you evaluate it? How would you implement it? And how long does that take? Because that's one of the areas that's common for idea people to overlook is, how are you going to even make someone aware of who you are? Where do they find their new technology? And then, of course, they all want to know, how can I try it out? And you need to understand what their buying process is like. So, selling something or inventing something in the medical technology space has a much longer timeline and buying cycle than selling something in the consumer electronics space, for example, simply because of the regulatory hurdles and burdens. Dealing or trying to sell something into the U.S. government or the military, for example, the buying cycle simply to get involved with them as a new supplier or vendor validation process, that can simply take years just to even become an approved supplier. And so you've got to build that into the expectations you have for both cost and time into whether your idea is really going to match up with the time and resources you have to implement it. So that's really the kind of discussions that you want to be having with these interview people, are kind of a big picture assessment of what that market's like, because it's an area where people often don't focus on. They didn't realize that the market they were trying to sell into has a very narrow committee process, and they only meet twice a year. And even once you get on that committee, it's another year and a half before you're approved and cycled. And so you could be 3 years out of even getting to try or getting some revenue if your idea is great and sellable. So it's something that has to be considered when you're deciding, how much resources to invest in something. And so with that, it's kind of a basic high level, but I was going to take you through kind of a real case study, and one of the ones that I worked on in grad school, which is really kind of neat because, again, I mentioned I'm an electronics engineer, I do medical technology stuff, but I decided to work on a more hardcore biotech, which is kind of outside my field of expertise. And so I was still able to use this particular process and walk through it and actually learn quite a bit of interesting things and how to get that data, and then, of course, how to present that data at the end in a go, no-go format. And so what we're talking here is a process, roughly 10 to 40 hours of work, depending on the complexity of your idea, to get to the point where we did in the case study I'm going to show you today. And so in this particular one, again, back to the fact I'm going to reinforce that ideas are commodities. None of us on the team that was working on this were the idea people in this case. It was a university patent technology that we thought was interesting. And so we decided to work with the researchers who had patented it to see if it had any potential sales or opportunity out there in the marketplace. It really was, walking in with someone else's idea and then going out to talk to people and determining if it was commercially viable. In this case, it was a vaccine technology, which I'll just share some high-level details about. And so the first thing that we had to do is, again, some of that basic research is what we're talking about. How many lives are saved by vaccines each year, how much money is spent in the market, how many people die or impacted by it, kind of what's the scope of what we're talking about when we're talking about immunizations or vaccines. And so those are things that you can get from those existing market research studies, from scientific organizations, from government databases, and things of that nature. So, what are the potential scale? What are we talking about in terms of opportunity? And then you have to be very careful with defining your particular market. And this is another area that people struggle with when they're trying to sell a new idea, either within or outside their company, is they assume that the whole world is the market. That every adult over the age of 25 will buy it, or that every school system, and that's rarely the case. You really need to be very specific about who is the best fit and what that market looks like in terms of defining your potential opportunity. So this was a vaccine technology, and so in this little diagram here, you can see vaccines, that big light blue circle, lots of money up there, but that's not really our market. Our market for this particular technology was a much smaller subset of that market, but you have to go out, and that's what you can use your research for, is to really define it very clearly as to how much spending research and opportunities going on in the specific subsegment that you can really compete or do something in, not the entire world, not the entire gaming market, software market, etc. So be very careful when defining who your users are and what that potential market is. And so in this particular case, just to talk a little bit about why this technology was a potential advantage, it was a dry vaccine technology. And most of you probably won't be familiar with this, but most vaccinations you get, either as children or adults, are part of what's called the cold chain. They have to be refrigerated from the time they're manufactured till the time they're administered to you. And so think about the challenges all over the world of making sure that that vaccine stays in cold packs, refrigeration, from the time it leaves the factory door, that's transported all over the world and gets to you as an end user. There's a lot of expense that goes into that, and it can become a real challenge in the developing world and developed countries where there's difficulty in transportation, difficulty with access to electricity. And so there's been a lot of focus on freeze-dried or special types of techniques that would eliminate the need for refrigeration. There are also a lot of technology challenges. And so in this case, you could potentially eliminate the entire cold chain, all the expense and overhead and waste that would go into that with a particular technology that these researchers invented. So we had a technology, it worked, they'd shown it in the lab, but who would be interested? Would they pay for it? What would it need to do? How would you prove it out? We had to go out and talk to people. And so, we went out and identified a little bit of everybody. You've got pharmaceutical manufacturers, you've got companies, you've got clinics, the doctors who administer them, inventors, research centers, people in finance, people in the regulatory side, the FDA, as well as foreign ones. You've got places, humanitarian organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Red Cross. You have to go out and actually identify key contacts, talk to these people, find out what their challenges are, and they're very different. So you might think you can, again, sell a vaccine technology like this, but not everyone cared, which we found out really easily, and they had different care about. So just an example, humanitarian organizations loved it. Great idea, but they're very bottom line cost focused. They need vaccines that cost pennies, nickels, dimes, and now you're talking about a technology process that's pricier. So to some extent, it might not be the best fit until it has been heavily commercialized and you can drop those manufacturing costs. In the United States, because we have so much access to the cold chain electricity, it's not really considered much of a problem. So they're like, I'm happy with what I have. It would have to be significantly cheaper or better for me to change, and vaccines are highly regulated. So, you have to come up with some better selling points. You're going to get some really good feedback from who cares. Then we talked to mobile clinics in the U.S. They cared because they transport things a lot. You'll find a lot of different spins. What's important will vary based on the market subsegment. What they will pay for will vary. The kinds of data they need will vary, and that's what these market interviews are good for. And then, of course, narrowing down the opportunity in terms of what is the pain, what is lost, what can you avoid with logistics and shipping costs and things that are there, what could you save, and defining those very well is important. And so, in this case, we were trying to define very simply what we're talking about. We've got a, vaccine that's existing that we can dry out, then put into a form that no longer requires cold chain storage. Something that would be very simple, something that you could use minimally trained staff to do and be able to get that vaccine or administration out there. But what we really wanted to show was something very much like this. What pain can we solve for you with this technology? Can you save money, in this case, by not having the special packaging, the special truck transport, the paperwork, the refrigeration monitoring that goes with it? You throw less away, because we throw a lot of vaccines away when they haven't been stored properly or delivered properly to a home or business. Do you have that IP protection? Is it stable? Does it do the form, fit, and function that they need? And then, of course, you have to look at who else might be competing out there and how do they stack up against you. So you make your little competitor grid. What do they offer? How stable are they? How advanced are they? How well known are they? And how would you compare yourself against them and stack up to them? And then you go out and look for, again, potential partners, because in this particular market, pharmaceuticals and medical devices, the regulatory process alone can run you in the millions. Most small companies wouldn't be able to do it alone. So who could you partner up with? What companies out there might be interested in working with you or using some of their resources to help you develop your equipment, your process, or deliver it out there, and who might buy you if you're something that would be spun off. So these are all part of that research process that you come up with as you're doing this QuickLIFT report. And so with that, as you go through this process, what you come out with in the end is, again, 10 to 40 hours of your time, basically less than a month's worth of your time, to help you really refine whether your idea, concept, or prototype is worth investing your valuable time, resources, and efforts in, so that you don't build a product that no one wants, or an idea that no one will pay for, or something that's great and they use it for free, but that really doesn't help you, or that you spend a lot of development time putting in features that weren't of interest when you could have had a much simpler project or product out on the market months before if you'd simply talked to your customers. Goal here is, rapid, affordable, and most importantly, data-driven. This is something that you can defend, right? It's not just your opinion or a coworker or friend's opinion. You've got real people who aren't your friends and family from the real marketplace who will tell you, yes, I would pay for this, or I would pay X for this, or this range, or no, that doesn't solve a problem I need. You've got real data to go on that becomes very compelling in making that presentation to management or potential investors or to friends or business partners. And the goal here, obviously, is to reduce that risk of failure. So if you do decide to pursue that idea, you know who and where those best markets, customers, and partners are. So again, you target your efforts and don't try to, conquer the whole world at once, and help you really come up with kind of the best approach to proceed if the technology does indeed seem viable and worth investing more resources in. And so with that, just a number of resources that I have in the bibliography here at the end if you wanted to read more, learn more about it, or look at some of the potential places where to find an idea and some of the research there. And of course, how to reach me if you want to discuss any of this further. Again, my email address and the phone number, please do feel free to contact me anytime. And with that, I will turn it over to any questions the group might have.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. We will now take everybody's questions. If you do have a question for Cheryl, we invite you to type it into the chat box, and we'll take them in order we receive them. As you're doing that, I'll take a moment to remind everybody once again that our third webinar for this month will be next Thursday, May the 25th, 12 o'clock Eastern Time, and that will be John Cachet presenting on engineering change management, the process. So hopefully many of you who are online today can join us next Thursday for that talk. Cheryl, I'm not seeing any questions.
Well, perfect. Well, then I will just share one final example, and of course anyone can feel free to follow up. But as I mentioned before, I still do a lot of these. I work closely with the University of Texas at Austin because they have a number of really neat kind of innovation and entrepreneurship programs. And so I do these kinds of quick look reports and assessments for all kinds of technologies. And it really is interesting to see how you can really help your own ideas or other people be more successful using these particular techniques, because we all have a tendency to get kind of a tunnel vision, especially if it's our own idea of what we had envisioned for it. And many times you'll go through these and you'll find, yeah, that was true, but where the much bigger opportunity or the really interested people are slightly over here, and if you could tailor your work or the idea just a little, you'd really have that blockbuster. And I can't tell you how many inventors I've spoken to who've got a really great product and they think they know who they're going to sell it to, but never spoke to a single person in that market or segment. They really have no idea if that's a product that those people needed, would pay for, and care about. I see that happen a lot, especially for people who think they're going to sell into schools or educational products or sell to the government. If you're not familiar with the process, and you haven't talked to those people, you're in for some really unpleasant surprises. If you get all the way to a development cycle before you start to talk to potential people. So the process, really does give you a very fascinating, sometimes surprising look at how to best implement ideas. And so I find it a really neat experience to go through each time I do it for different technologies. And one of the neat things I also find about it too is it's actually better sometimes if you are not the subject matter expert on a particular technology, because you can do these even for technology you know nothing about. And sometimes it's actually more interesting because you come to the idea with a fresh perspective or a different way of looking at it. And so it's a really neat and fascinating process to go through.
Cheryl, it looks like you have one question.
Okay, so let's see. Internal changes, continuous improvement needs. Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the things that I thought was really fascinating, because there's a lot of the literature that you see on innovation. A lot of times assumes that you are trying to launch a new business or something on your own or in kind of a startup format, rather than selling an idea or improving things within your organization. And I've actually found that it can be a really valuable tool within the organization, again, because it comes back to that hard data. How do you sell your idea? If you went to your management and you've got, well, I talked to 25 real users and customers, I use this to come up with the grid of what they care about, what they think is important. It can really help you sell a concept or idea, at least get the resources to pursue it further. And it really is, you think about it, most innovations, or a lot of innovations, majority probably of just innovation, is incremental. There are plenty of the blockbusters, and they get a lot of the attention. That's what we call kind of like business porn, right? They get rich, make millions with this blockbuster idea. But most of what we do is the smaller, subtle changes that can really benefit a business, keep you afloat, make things simpler, better, and streamlined. But how do you get that change, the resources to do it within an organization, make it stick? This process, I think, can be really valuable because it, again, is data-driven and not just well, it's my idea, or I think it'll work, or I've seen a case study elsewhere. It's really truly customized to your businesses and circumstances.
Okay, does anybody else have questions for Cheryl? Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Cheryl, did you have any other comments that you wanted to add?
Well, again, feel free to contact me for follow-up. And like I said, I put some resources in there, which I particularly like. I really like Rob Adams and then John Daly on the advocacy front. I profiled some of his work in the webinar last fall on, how to sell it. This is how to gather the data, right? And it does come up with a report at the end. But you still have to be an effective salesperson for your idea. So how do you take this data and put it, into a format that also makes it compelling. And so that can be a struggle for a lot of technical people too. And I talked about that earlier in today's presentation on kind of like that problem statement, that you don't focus when you're kind of selling your idea or kind of pitching this up, the quick look report. You're not talking about features. You're not talking about that long list of what it does. You're really focusing on the problem it solves, and that's something that your management and the budget makers understand. They don't need to be technology experts, and you don't either. What you need to understand is, how does it impact my business? Will it let me do the same work with less people? Will it speed up the time in which I can get the work done? Will it improve the accuracy, the quality, or reliability? Will it allow me to do things that I couldn't do before? Those are kind of back to the problem things, not, the exact mechanisms of how it works or what it looks like, but what the problem is and why it would be worth an investment to solve that particular problem, which makes for a much more compelling business sell story. And, is typically not what engineers, I've been guilty of it myself in the past. I get so caught up in how cool this is and the idea and the mechanics of it. You want to talk all about that, and everyone's eyes start to glaze over, and you forget that, we all have different care abouts. We're looking at it from a different perspective, and so what do they care about? So, that's part of the advocacy part. Once you've done your quick look, is then, if it's a go, how you then begin to sell that to get people to buy in.
Okay. Well, it looks like there's no further questions. It is a few minutes before the hour, so I think that'll probably do it here for today. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Cheryl, for presenting today, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day, and we hope to see some of you possibly next Thursday. Until then, thanks again, and we'll be online soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye now.